Hello everybody and welcome. My name is Michael Harkey. I am the Programming Coordinator and unofficial webinar announcer for Infotex. Welcome and thank you for joining us today for our webinar on incident response in the domain age. This is the fifth stop of our 2016 IT Governance Tour. Our next webinar is on May 11th, entitled Drilling Down on the CAT Incident Response Statements. All dates and webinar topics are subject to change. So, on to our main events. Many of you may already know Dan as the moderator of the Fall Information Security Conference for the Indiana Bankers Association. He runs our company, Infotex, which is a managed security services firm as well as a IT audit firm. He has 13 letters after his name, and they're all about information security. He's the awareness guru from Indiana, and he's not afraid of no ghost, unless that ghost has an elevated inherent risk profile. Dan?
Okay, thank you, Mike. I definitely appreciate that introduction. For those of you who have been coming to my webinars, I'm encouraging Mike to make his introductions interesting, especially when it comes to introducing me. I don't know about everybody here at the webinar, but boy, it was not too long after June 30th that I started calling the cybersecurity assessment tool the CAT. And so I just want you to know that you're going to see this character right here throughout the probably the rest of my seminars this year at least. This is Marge. Marge is Chad Smith's cat. Chad is our NOC manager, and so we've kind of adopted Marge as the symbol of the cybersecurity assessment tool. Another thing I really feel compelled to establish before we get into this is that when we're talking about incident response, I'm a firm believer that your managed security service provider can help you out. And so a lot of what we're presenting today is from the perspective of an MSSP. And so what that means is, A, your MSSP might have a different take, but B, I guess what we're doing is we're queuing up a conversation for you to have with your managed security service provider when it comes to that. And then finally, I also feel that I owe you all an explanation. Last month when we held our webinar about data flow diagramming, we announced this webinar with the title Simplifying Incident Response. But as we started proceeding with preparing the webinar, it became very clear that at least this year, if you think you're going to be simplifying your incident response programs, you're probably fooling yourself. And the main reason why is because of that cybersecurity assessment tool. The fact that, it is so heavy in incident response means that we're all probably going to need to take our incident response plans and shore them up a little bit with some of the statements that may be missing depending on our maturity level and that sort of thing. And so I apologize that this webinar is not exactly going to be about simplifying incident response, but do know that we have other webinars, other workshops, etc., planned to help in that regard. What we are going to be talking about is how incident response is inherent across all 5 domains of the cybersecurity assessment tool, primarily domains 2, 3, and 5. I mean, domain 5 is the incident response domain, but it really helps punctuate what we've been saying about incident response all along, because we believe that incident response is more about preparation and protection, domains 2 and 3, than it is about, the actual response when that incident does occur, which is, of course, domain 5. So, but I don't know if we're all on the same page about the cybersecurity assessment tool, so we'll start with, just kind of getting everybody on the same page about the cybersecurity assessment tool, what we like and don't like about the CAT and that sort of thing. And then really, in order to get to the notion of incident response across the 5 domains, I need to talk to you about what we're going to be looking for when we come in and audit banks and credit unions in 2016, maybe going into 2017 a little bit if you're behind on, getting started. And then we want to talk about that fifth step of the cybersecurity assessment tool, the analysis and interpretation step, because we believe that's where really you're going to start establishing to-dos and establishing new processes for your incident response program. And then we will finally get to the incident response program, and then of course talk about the debate I've been having with a lot of my clients for the last several years over the periodic nature of your incident response team meetings. And I do believe that you'll see that the cybersecurity assessment tool is causing Dan to win that argument. There's a lot of work that needs to be done. It needs to be done by a multidisciplinary team, and so why not perform that work during a monthly incident response team meeting? So when it comes to the CAT, I mean, boy, everywhere you go, you can read, information about the cybersecurity assessment. We're starting to get alarmed last fall because, everybody was talking about cyber this and cyber that. It's supposedly a voluntary tool. I just heard again yesterday and last week I've been, privileged to meet with a couple bank examiners, and they both basically are saying it is voluntary, but if you don't use it, you should be using something. So what would you use? And the bottom line is we're going to have to get through the cybersecurity assessment. The other thing is I do hear rumors, but I have talked directly to somebody who's rather high up in the FDIC, and he says that don't believe the rumors. But I am hearing clients report that the FDIC is saying that they want to redo the tool, and so some of my clients are asking, hey, if it's going to be redone, do we really need to conduct our assessment this year? And my answer to that is go ahead and get started on the tool the way it is now. You're going to gain a lot of good knowledge, and I wouldn't risk the compliance risk of an examiner coming in and finding out that you've decided to ignore this extremely prevalent guidance, okay? And yes, there is a rumor out there that the people that wrote the cybersecurity assessment were dog lovers. So let's talk a little bit about how this came about, okay? How did we end up with the cybersecurity assessment tool in the first place? And so the bottom line is that in about 2010 or so, the federal government realized that they're breaching more information than their regulatees. In other words, there's more data going out the door from the federal government than there is from all banks combined. But they're not just regulating banks. And so, of course, in great federal government fashion, it took them about 4 years, but by February 2014, they finally committed to a framework that they wanted all federal information systems to comply with. And that framework was the NIST cybersecurity framework, very heavy on incident response. You probably, if you're complying with the state CATO guidance, the corporate account takeover guidance that the DFIs of many states published in about 2014, 2013, you'll recognize that a lot of it is based on the cybersecurity framework itself. And so throughout that year of 2014, the FFIEC then realized, holy cow, this has a lot of stuff in it that doesn't look familiar. And so they decided to conduct an assessment against this NIST cybersecurity framework of 500 pilot banks, and they presented their observations in a very good document in December 2014. And I could talk about all the speculation that occurred over the next 6 months, but suffice it to say that on June 30th of last year, they then doubled down, basically came out with the cybersecurity assessment tool, really had a big rollout, process, and we really ended up with some neat iconography that Dan can add into his slideshows, right? And so for those of you who haven't gotten through the first phase or second phase of the, the suggested 5 steps, we need to start by, measuring our inherent risk, and then across 5 different domains that deal with 5 different topics or 5 different categories or, assessment factors. We need to, really decide how mature we are in each of these components of these 5 different domains. And there's a very well prescribed process that we need to follow in order to say that we have fully gotten through our first iteration of the cybersecurity assessment. And if this is the first time you're seeing this, boy, you better get out to FFIEC.gov and download the documents that you can get by clicking on these links and get started on your cybersecurity assessment. Because at the end of the day, what ended up happening, and you got to admit, that's pretty cool. I'm going to do that again just because I really like it. But at the end of the day, what really ended up happening is the cybersecurity assessment tool allowed the FFIEC to clarify their guidance and bring it more in line with this cybersecurity framework. And then it also, and the part that I'm very excited about, by the way, is it allowed us to then bring in the capability maturity model, which is an approach towards process improvement, an approach towards auditing, quite frankly, that I am glad to see is finally here. And really what I'm saying about this is that instead of saying yes, no to a checklist question that some auditor brings in, now we can say, well, to a certain extent, and then we can actually establish to what extent we're addressing a particular control. FS-ISAC, was really kind of pulled in. It's a good idea. I still am concerned that my smaller banks are going to be overloaded with a lot of noise. FS-ISAC has always been known to be the noisy mailing list, the listserv. But it is a big part of the cybersecurity assessment tool. And then finally, there was some weaknesses in the vendor management guidance, even the 2013 OCC guidance. And so the tool does shore up some of those weaknesses. Primarily, where is our data is finally being asked, even though the previous guidance wasn't clear about our need to determine where our data was. As a matter of fact, it said that you need to determine where it is when feasible. And so there are some issues. I mean, we can complain all day long about the cat if we want to, right? But the main thing I'm worried about is that we finally have our board and our management team, realizing that cybersecurity or information security is important. And now we're going to be going into them, telling them that we're at least or minimal inherent risk. And so we need to make sure that the board understands that that's in comparison to Bank of America and Wells Fargo. Okay, and that's all there is to it. That the part, the inherent risk part of the cybersecurity assessment tool, while a great idea, is designed to help the federal government measure risk across all of banking. And so, there are some concerns that we have with, telling our board that we don't have a lot of risk. And then meanwhile, we do find there to be some balance issues. It's really weird. I mean, I just ran into it yesterday with an examiner because we were kind of arguing about the fact that moderate risk vendors, in the parlance of this particular bank, should be reviewed annually. And I was like, well, high risk vendors aren't even audited according to this annually unless they're at the advanced level of maturity. And so, if you're not getting their audits annually, how can you review them annually? And so anyway, I think I did finally get that examiner to understand. And that examiner, by the way, did get me to understand a few things too. And, I really want to, stress that if you develop a good relationship with your examiner, it's because it's a two-way street and you're given a little bit as well. So, and by the way, these numbers here, you'll understand them a little bit as we get further into this webinar, but, we have this balance issue, whereas another example, we're requiring log consolidation as an intermediate level of maturity, but reviewing all logs after an event is a baseline level of maturity. Well, unless you want to spend a lot of money on it, or, just simply can't, not be able to do it, you're going to have to achieve an intermediate level of maturity in order to meet your baseline statement. And so, there are a few things in there. So we do think that, after the first iteration, I think, that we can see the FFIEC coming back and fixing a few of the idiosyncrasies with the cybersecurity assessment tool. And yes, there is a turf war, I tell you, between the OCC and the FDIC about this. The OCC is really starting to look like a one-size-fits-all organization, and the FDIC is very scalable. And so, the FDIC wants some of the baseline statements, I think, to go to evolving because their little banks simply can't meet them. Now, having said that, we need to comply. We need to get the CAT. We need to get through it. It's a good idea. There are a lot of good things coming out of people's walking through those 5 steps. At first and foremost is that there has been a lot of new theory about information security and cybersecurity since the last guidance in 2006, okay? And so the FFIEC really does need to update their guidance. And, bottom line is that they need to do it in a manner that protects themselves legally as well. And then I also need to admit that as an MSSP, we love the cybersecurity assessment tool because in the past, prior to the CAT, there were, a lot of our services that we couldn't look our customers in the eye and say, hey, guidance requires this. Whereas now, in order to be at baseline or evolving level of maturities, you need to have those services in place. And it does mitigate legal risk, doesn't it, Michael?
Yeah, for the government.
Anyway, sorry about that. I just decided to throw a little bit of humor into our thing there. So let's move on to, what we are going to be looking for when we go into a bank and audit a bank. And so, what I'm wanting to see my clients do is between now and, I would like it by the end of 2016, but I am starting to tell some of my smaller banks that haven't got started yet that, at least by the end of first quarter 2017, you should be through this 5th step, is what I'm telling my clients. And of course, bringing up a slide like this and saying, read, the information in the links and follow this, that's a lot easier said. And so let's kind of drill down a little bit about what I would be looking for. And so I'm going to want to make sure that, and of course, if I come in and audit you tomorrow, I'm thinking that you should be probably through the 1st step, which is that CEO overview, which is a document. I think it's 7 pages, 5 pages long. It's a very well-written, concise document. And we want to see the board minutes of one of your board meetings reflect the fact that, A, the overview was read not only by the board members, but we're wanting the minutes to say that you've reported to the board that the management team has read it, that your technical team has read it, and that the board of directors has read it, and then that you have actually walked them through it and kind of summarized it verbally with them in that meeting, and then that you've developed a strategy for getting through your first iteration of the cybersecurity assessment tool. Now, I think that my slideshow probably ends up showing, boy, I was not supposed to show IP addresses, and I ended up doing it anyway. Hopefully nobody was able to write those down. But anyway, so I just want you to know that when we get to that slide, we're trying to make this easier for you. And so we've got boilerplates. I mean, boilerplate for board minutes sounds dumb, but at least I guess I need to bring it over here. At least it allows you to, have a starting point for, what will you tell, the secretary of the board to insert into the minutes. One of the things that I'm finding as I start coaching board of director meetings, which I'm doing a lot more often now, and it's really kind of a result of the cybersecurity assessment tool. But what I'm finding is that, if you just walk out or say, make sure this gets into the board minutes, you're going to fail. You're going to be frustrated. You're not going to have what should be in the board minutes put into the board minutes. So what I like to do is I like to go into the board meeting and really kind of hand and email a document, or have a document ready for the board secretary that makes it easy for them to establish exactly what we want those board minutes to say, because auditors are checking board minutes now. And really that's what I want to do. I want, the main thing I want to see is that the board is engaged, that they're involved in this process at the level that the CEO overview and by the way, the easiest step is step 2, that the user's guide establishes the board should be involved. Now, the step 2 is the easiest because all you have to do is read the user guide. And if you haven't done that, you should read that user's guide. We had a workshop on cyber compliance last week, and it was the only time I actually, at least in recent years, I actually said, everybody needs to read this before we move on to the next, section, because it is important to read that user guide. Now, when it comes to the 3rd step, what I would propose you do, and I'll talk about it more, why, but take a process, take an iterative process, I should say. In other words, start off by going through inherent risk with your technical team. What you're going to find there is that you'll have to reach out probably to people who are not on that technical team. And by the way, that technical team should be kind of a subset of the committee that you're assigning the cybersecurity assessment to. It could be your IT steering committee, it could be your incident response team, or whatever. But a subset of that team can start the inherent risk process and then make sure that you actually present it to the committee. If you can demonstrate through a paper trail that the committee, had some concerns, you made some changes to it, now you've got 2 iterations of the inherent risk assessment before you take it to the board. And you want your paper trail to show those 2 iterations. And then again, the board, first of all, we're updating them with the status. Because by the way, your strategy that you've articulated in, your first board minutes is basically saying that we want a status. And so here's the status. We've finished the inherent risk assessment. Here's the results of that inherent risk assessment, which for most of my clients is going to be at least a minimal risk. There might be some areas where you pop up into the moderate risk level. And then we're going to establish a risk appetite. And what I'm proposing, and we're kind of making this up as we go. I don't want to suggest that this is something I've gone to a seminar given by an examiner or anything and seen, because as usual, they're pretty tight-lipped. They want to see what we're going to come up with, and then they'll come out with this is what I'd like to see. And by the way, I think this is the Chris Badel from Badel Security tool. We are, we're using somebody else's tool in the example here. And if you haven't seen our boilerplates before, we have color coding in our boilerplates. But the risk appetite statement, we believe should be expressed in terms of, what should be reported to the bank or to the board. Okay, in other words, and for most, actually I would have to say for all of our clients, we're suggesting that you start off saying, based on the fact that you're probably at least or minimal, maybe very rarely at moderate risk, that the board requires you to report anytime you're not at a baseline level of maturity. Okay, and we'll talk a little bit more why that can be your risk appetite statement. Now, if you're a larger bank, if you're doing some things where you're at moderate levels of inherent risk, more often than not, you might have to establish this to be evolving level of maturity. Okay, and so it shouldn't have just made that change there. But anyway, so these all, by the way, are going to be available on a portal. I will get you the link to them when we get done with this webinar. And also know, for those of you who were at the workshop, I think it was 2 weeks ago, we did update this document here. And so you might want to, if you haven't gotten through the one you got at the workshop, we do have a newer version of the CAPMate. But that brings us then to the 4th step. And once again, as an auditor, I'm going to want to see an iterative process, and again, the guidance, by the way, doesn't say you have to do it this way. I'm just suggesting that I will be very pleased if I see that you've started off with a small group of people that might have to reach out of that group to get some information from people. But by the time you are presenting it to the committee, you've got a fully completed first iteration of your maturity assessment, where what you're doing is you're going through and you're looking at 494 different statements across, a whole bunch of components. And if any of those statements are not in place, you can't say that you have the component in place, right? And so we want to present to the committee not only, here's, where we're not at baseline, but also there's a lot of other issues that are going to come out of your first and second iteration, such as we really don't know if we're at baseline in this particular case, or not only are we at baseline, but we know, we're auditing this, or we don't think this applies to us. And there's a lot of statements, by the way, in there that I think you can make the case that you don't think it applies to us. And then, by the way, I don't know if you're noticing, but I'm skipping going to the board after the maturity assessment, because why bog the board down with the maturity assessment results until you've interpreted and analyzed those results? And so, and what I'm saying there is, we can present to the committee, by the time we get to this, it might just be the ISO that's interpreting and analyzing the results. So we don't need to, take as much of a technical team approach. Now, if you want to throw that technical team in there, I'm sure that, that's going to only add to the process, only make the process that much better. But at the end of the fifth step, then we need to have, again, a status. We're going to update the board. We're finished with our first iteration of cybersecurity assessment, which actually took us 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 different iterations to get to this point. But we've calculated what our residual risk is, and we do have some issues where we're not at baseline, or where we're not sure, or where we don't think it applies to us. And here's our action plan for mitigating what we found in the cybersecurity assessment. And so I don't know if you're noticing here, I as an auditor am looking for the action plan at the end of this year, not the mitigation. And that's why I think a lot of us might want to slow down. I'm seeing some banks put the cart before the horse, and they're working up all their data flow diagrams, which is great. But if you haven't done other things that might represent more risk, it's going to be a shame that you already have your data flow diagrams done, but you don't have these other higher risk items even, considered. And so, we're saying establish an action plan, slow down, do what they tell you to do, and then we can go from there. Okay, and so suffice it to say, at the end of this webinar, we will give you a link where when you go to that link, you just download it. It'll be a 1 zip file, I believe, where on the portal you can get all these board minutes and some other boilerplates that we're making available as part of this webinar. So, and then again, this is the first iteration of our board minute templates, and actually it's the first time we ever created templates for board minutes. And so, we haven't gotten feedback on these yet. We're not saying that this is the end of the process. That you might be able to take them and make them better just because of the way you relate to your board and you have more experience writing board minutes, maybe. But what I'd like to talk about now is what we kind of run into already, and what we anticipate running into when we audit our clients, which starts with the fact that we didn't lay that paper trail, that the board was involved every step along the way as required by the 5-step process. That's just kind of a no-brainer. As much of it is a no-brainer as it is, I'm always surprised when I find that the board minutes aren't there, and I think it might be because the secretary doesn't know how to write up what happened when you were in the board meeting. So meanwhile, I would like to see iterations. I would like to see that you started off with this assessment, you had a whole bunch of stuff missing from it, a bunch of stuff marked as we're not sure, and then the next time you did it, when you met with the management team, you solved some of those, you answered some of those questions, and then finally you presented it to your committee and made even more changes. That's what I'd like to see as an auditor. Now, is that required? Not really, but the spirit of the guidance requires it, because we want to make sure it's a multidisciplinary approach. And by the way, I am seeing a couple clients that, hey, it only took me 2 hours, and the reason why is because they went through it on their own. They decided a lot of it didn't apply to them, but they didn't really have what I would say a good oversight on that process. In other words, if you don't think it applies to you, that's fine, but you should share that notion with the rest of your team, and especially the board of directors. Okay, and so, there needs to be, some kind of a method of establishing, when we're not sure, when we don't think something applies, when we think it's kind of in what we're doing is kind of in the gray area. When you find yourself saying technically we are in compliance with that statement, I feel like instead of just saying, yep, we're in compliance with it, you might want to mark that and come back to it and revisit it and decide, what do we have to do to take away the qualifier here? So that by the time the examiners are coming in and looking over our shoulders, they will agree with our, gray areas. Hey, Michael, has there been a question that came in from the audience?
Hey, Dan. Nope, not yet.
Well, that's because we have a question from Mark Edding, one of our cartoon characters. And what he's asking is, how are you documenting this? And very good question. And towards that, okay, I'm wanting to establish and make available to, my clients, our webinar attendees, a method of documenting everything that I'm talking about here as you go through your iterations of the cybersecurity assessment tool. And so when we get to that fifth step, okay, the analysis and interpretation, to me, that's really where it starts to become our baby. It's where it starts to become our job to establish what we mean by the guidance. And so, we want to make sure that we're documenting and escalating, where our maturity levels align with risk, which really brings me to the next part of our agenda. And it kind of is focused around the notion of interpret and analyze. I don't know if you've noticed this yet, but one of the things I love about the cybersecurity assessment tool is that there's no link here. Okay, that's the reason why this is a different color than everything else, is that they haven't spelled out for us how we're going to analyze the results. And so, what I do is that case is I'm going to read very carefully what they're saying in the paragraph here. Okay, and by the way, also, if you look at the user's guide, there is, plenty of information in there in terms of what they want us to do when it comes to analysis and interpretation. And so what I'm, in my own mind, thinking the action items are from the analysis and interpretation process is that we need to justify our minimum required maturity levels. So in other words, remember that appetite statement where the board said, that, hey, if we're not at baseline, you need to present that to me. Well, our analysis and interpretation needs to justify that baseline is where we need to be. And there might be in some cases after you've been through the full assessment where in your own mind you're thinking, really, in this area, we probably should be at evolving because of our inherent risk. And so we need that needs to be a part of the analysis and interpretation. Hopefully we won't have to go granular on that. In other words, where it's very easy for the board to say anytime we're not at baseline. But what you want to avoid having to do, and unfortunately some medium-sized banks are going to have to do, is say, except in the components, blah, 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 where the board should be notified when we're not at evolving. You follow what I'm saying? Or, so the point is that, there might be some areas in that tool where your examiners and auditors are going to require you to be at an evolving state of maturity. And so, we need to have an ability to address that in our analysis and interpretation. We also need to, in my opinion, risk rank where we're not at minimum required maturity level. And this really is becoming very handy for our clients where they do need to be at evolving because they're at baseline in most of the areas except for the common issues I'll be talking about later. But they're not at evolving in many more areas, and so they need to risk rank where they're not at the minimum required maturity level so that they can prioritize how they're going to address the gap. Okay, and that's really the first step in developing the plan for addressing the gap. Is there another question, Mike?
I have a feeling there might be.
Oh, really? Yes, there is. Joan Department wants to know, well, how are we going to track all this? And I'm actually going to be getting to that. But before I get there completely, let me just kind of, drill down a little bit into that maturity inherent risk relationship. If you look at the user's guide, that second step, this is a very, very important chart to understand. And so what we're basically saying is that if you're at a least or minimal risk level, then you're going to get away with, at least initially in your first iteration, being at baseline. But if you're not at baseline on a certain statement, then you need to, by the end of this year, if I'm auditing you, have an action plan as to how you're going to get to baseline in the various statements where you might not be at baseline. Likewise, if you have minimal inherent risk, which you may have if you're transferring wires or ACHs or whatever, then the good news is that baseline is still allowed, but you might want to start recognizing that over time your auditors and examiners are going to be starting to make the case that you need to be at a higher level of maturity given your inherent risk level. And so the analysis interpretation, at least this year, should really be focused in on that risk appetite statement. Is it sufficient? Is our auditors going to be okay with it? That sort of thing. And again, you might have to get granular on that. So Mike, I'm not going to make you come in, but even Marge wants to know, how are we going to track all this, right? And so what I've been getting to is that we've created a tool that we think might make it easier for you to handle your analysis and interpretation and to lay a paper trail in a work papers fashion that your board of directors, don't need to actually see the work papers, but it will feed what gets presented to the board. It'll establish what you don't think is applicable for your bank, et cetera, and why. And so, this is just a normal boilerplate, by Infotex. Color coding still applies. What we're basically saying in the transfer of copyright agreement is that, you have the right to say that this is copyrighted as your bank once you customize it to your bank, but in exchange, we don't want you to just give this to anybody, that you should have our permission before you give this away. And so it has an inherent risk profile that, is very similar to the other tools you've seen. We really haven't, taken this to the next level. I can even see here in some cases that, we need to, do a better job of formatting our spreadsheet. And then it has this tab here, which if you notice, this is set up for most of my clients where their required maturity level, again, as in their risk appetite statement, is baseline across the board. But if you're coding, if you're developing your own software applications, you might end up deciding that you need to be evolving in that particular area. Or if you've got a lot of risk when it comes to maybe you're hosting your own website, then maybe you decide you need to be at evolving when it comes to all of the components that would protect a hosted website. Does that make sense? And so this is where you can track your your granular, your non-homogeneous risk appetite statement. And then it finally comes to maturity analysis, where we've really kind of brought a lot of value to the equation, and I really probably get ahead of myself here. So what I want to make sure you understand is that what this is going to help us do is it's going to help us track the gray areas where we're saying that something's not applicable to us, and what we're already testing versus what we're not testing. And it's really all is in this column H here. And what we're what we're doing is we're using numbers to kind of help establish where we are. So what we're basically saying is if you're in compliance with the statement, you're going to enter a 2. If it's not applicable, you'll enter a 1. If you're in compliance but you're actually testing it, you'll enter a 3. If you're not sure, you'll enter a -1. And what that ends up doing, and I'm looking at the time, I'm not going to be able to have time to drill into that much detail, but it ends up giving you the ability to track those various issues that need to be tracked. And then meanwhile, and by the way, we've gone in and risk ranked everything that's a baseline statement, but this also then gives you the ability to risk rank where you're not at your required minimum maturity level. And so, if you've established that baseline is your, your minimum maturity level, and you're not at baseline, then you could risk rank this and end up with a, using filtering, ending up with the tactical plan as to what you're going to do to react to the cybersecurity assessment, which statements you need to work on. The statements that you're declaring are not applicable, which, to me would, for all of my clients, are probably going to be the component related to secure coding, right? Let me just search for that here. And so I think it's very conceivable that, I mean, you're going to say that you don't develop any code in-house and therefore these statements really don't apply to you. Well, as an auditor, I'm wanting to see where you say it's not applicable. If you can get your auditor's blessing that, yes, we agree this is not applicable to you, that's certainly going to put you in a better position if some examiner's comes around and asks you, why a single location bank isn't, following secure coding practices. Well, because you don't do any coding, so it doesn't apply to you. But we want to track that. We want to make sure that the board knows that there are X number of statements that we feel just don't apply to us, and we've run them by our auditors, and the auditors agree, or we've changed the status of one to not sure because we're arguing with the auditor about it, or we've changed the status of one to not compliant because the auditor has made the case, and we've decided to agree with the auditor that it does apply to us. But that is part of analysis and interpretation. What doesn't apply to us? And then, it gives you the ability to track what's not at required maturity level. I will say that if you've decided a certain statement, a component, by the way, needs to be at a higher level than baseline, then you need to change the math on that in order to get this to say not compliant. And then finally, we've done, some other analysis and interpretation of our own, which I'm going to be getting to in a few minutes here. But the bottom line is that one of the main things I love about the cybersecurity assessment, and by the way, we call this the CAT-MATE, it's the Maturity Analysis and Interpretation Tool, which I know is quite frankly just kind of an extension of our metaphor for cats there, but that's Cooper, by the way. That's Marge's boyfriend's name is Cooper. And so anyway, long story short, the numbering scheme has made our life so much easier at Infotex, because I'm sure you've been running into, that one statement in domain 2 where we're not at evolving, and if we can hit that statement, we'll actually be able to declare we're at evolving for the whole component. And by the way, I'm hoping that you catch that when you read the user guide, but the actual tool is not at the statement level, it's at the component level. And so you want to be able to say that you're at baseline in monitoring and analyzing. And you'll see this when you get to cyber, when you read the user guide. And so you need to hit both of these statements to be able to say you're monitoring and analyzing at a baseline level. Okay, and so we broke it down to the statement level primarily because what we've realized as we're going through this on our own is that any of those areas where we're not at, I'm going to say innovative, we want to track those at the statement level so we can know what to do we need to work on in order to get at that particular maturity level. But referring to it by number is so much easier than referring to it by that one statement in domain 2 where we're not at evolving or whatever. So becomes a really good tool to analyze and really to be the paper trail of the work papers for your analysis and interpretation, that fifth step in the tool. And so how we mark each statement, there's 494 statements to go through. I'm really hoping my clients don't do this, but I have had several people say, well, what I'm going to do is I know our minimum required maturity level is baseline, so I'm just going to filter to baseline and go through that part of it because I need to get through this. The FDIC told me they're going to update it, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this until I get the final version, but I do know I need to be at baseline, so that's what I'm focusing in on. And so voila, the power of filtering is really helping us with that. So I'm noticing the time, by the way, this is a webinar that will run a little bit over the hour. I'm sorry to those that have to leave right at 11 o'clock. So it becomes this paper trail that will then, yes.
Hey Dan, with that in mind, I have a question that I think is pretty good that I'd like to get in here. Sure. Would you mind now, or would you want me to wait on that?
I think it would be good if we got that in there now.
Okay. Nick asked, if we have a custom application that was developed several years ago and no code escrow was put in the contract, is there any option besides just replacing that application? This is a baseline statement for secure coding.
Okay, and actually, Nick, that's an excellent question. The answer to that, I would like to, if you don't mind, kind of make it an example for everybody else, okay? But what Nick is basically saying is that you have a legacy application that was, well, actually, you're wanting to know if it was in escrow, so I'm thinking you must be talking about domain 4 there. Well, I guess it's right there. All right, and so that is a baseline statement. If you have, some a legacy application or some custom developed code that's not in escrow, then in this case, what I would do is I would basically, and I always kind of go up here just to kind of remind myself, but I feel like you're going to basically end up saying that you're not in compliance with that one. And then you're going to track it as a baseline statement where you're not in compliance, which means that you're going to have to present that to the board that, we're not in compliance with this baseline statement. And that's actually where you would bring that out and have that be one of the bullet points in your board report that, needs to, be delivered once you're done with your analysis interpretation. Now, having said that, you also might feel that, hey, you know what, in this particular case, I'm going to at least have a conversation with my auditor about it, because I feel like we can say that, hey, this is an old code, we're working towards replacing it anyway, blah, 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 and so the point I'm trying to make is that what this is going to do is this is going to allow you to capture and escalate where you're not at the level of maturity that this tool says you should be at based on your inherent risk, and present that to the board. And then from there, you might decide that, hey, you know what, we're not going to be able to address this issue, so we're always not going to be at baseline here. The board needs to accept the risk that we're not at baseline in this particular case because it's not worth the money to redesign the whole application just so we can have the source code for it in escrow. And so I hope that answers your question, Nick, and I hope you don't mind me kind of taking it and using it as an example of how you can use this tool to document your thought process, or at least help you keep track of the issues that need further thought. And then because you wouldn't be at baseline with it, then you would want to risk rank it, and in this case, to me, based on what you're saying there, the likelihood, by the way, if you're not at maturity, the likelihood of it causing a problem is going to be an 8, at least at first, because, there might be compliance issues with your examiners. Okay, and so that's my thinking there. I've had several clients tell me, well, we're not going to go with it that way. We're saying that the likelihood of it, being a compliance risk, yeah, that's high, but the likelihood of us not having escrow or source code and escrow causing, us an issue is very low, because we haven't made a change this application for the last, 10 years, and so, we think that the risk of it's very low anyway. And so now when you're presenting it to the board, you're saying we do have this one area where technically we're not at baseline, but the risk is very low, and I would rather focus in on those areas where we're not at baseline and the risk is moderate or high. So I hope that makes sense to you. Now, if we were to say, I guess you got to take the, we're saying we're not compliance there, and then you see how the color there changes. I know it's color, but boards like colors, right? But you wouldn't present, by the way, I hope nobody would present this spreadsheet to the board. You might present, the results of the spreadsheet to the board, or at least a lay person's, interpretation of what this says. But I'm certainly not meaning that you would present this to the board. Moving along, and Nick, let Mike know if we didn't answer your question well enough. I'd be happy to get with you, after the webinar.
He said yes.
But
thank you.
Okay, all right, good. Moving along, paper trail. Again, I think I've kind of covered all these issues here in the interest of getting to the main reason why, we have this webinar, which is the bottom line is, and really what I haven't showed you yet, but we also then have kind of aired a little audit dirty laundry, might be a good way of putting it. And I do see that we have a couple audit clients in our audit, or in our audience, I should say. But when we first saw the cybersecurity assessment tool, let's face it, like everybody else, we focused in on the baseline statements, and we were aghast to see some of them as auditors, because we're like, ooh, we're not auditing for that. Well, we're auditing medium banks for that, but we're certainly not auditing small banks for that. And so the notion of are we auditing for it or not became the the driver of this column here, which basically is a list of all the issues where we expect a lot of our clients might not have baseline, and some of our clients might not be at baseline. And so these are what we call the common issues, okay? And then if you start to look, all right, well, which of these common issues relate to incident response, which is this column over here. T means the incident response team. Now we're starting to realize, now you're starting to see how, if we can address these issues, and I guess what we're saying is you might not have these in place, especially if you're being audited by Infotechs. But if we can address these issues, now we're bringing our incident response plan up to speed across all the domains. And do you see, by the way, how domains 2, 3, and 5 are really, the bigger areas? Now, fortunately, I think we were a little more diligent on auditing incident response than, we were on everything else, which, is probably just because we're a managed security service provider as well, and so we're really big on incident response. I'm not sure. But it does bring me to the main gist, if you do need to drop off early, of this presentation, is that we've identified in column F here whether or not the baseline statement is an incident response. It should be addressed in your incident response program. And as we are doing that, we realize, you know what? Some of this stuff really can be addressed by a subsystem of the incident response team, or a subset of the incident response team. And by the way, it's really these two statements at a baseline level. Okay. And then some of these can be addressed by the incident response team. And so, again, we're filtered down to baseline. And so this is kind of the approach that we're recommending our clients take when it comes to, how do we shore up our incident response program, knowing that doing that is going to help us in general across the board when it comes to being at baseline, and quite frankly, any areas where you might be at a higher, or be required to be at a higher level of maturity, there's a good chance that it would be an incident response type issue where you would be at a higher level of maturity. And so, suffice it to say, you can use this tool once you've answered all these questions, which you might have already answered them all in one format at a component level. And so, yes, what I'm suggesting is you take the extra hour it's going to take to transfer those answers into this spreadsheet. And it really only takes about an hour once you've been through the tool the first time, because you already know what the answers are, right? Unless you've done a bad job of documentation, which, means you should probably start off with this tool anyway. But if you look at the threat analysis, event log management, anomaly detection, incident response testing, and forensics, these are the common issues that most of our clients did not have in place when the cybersecurity assessment tool was published on June 30th. And change management. Now, don't get me wrong, there's other statements, and there's actually 85 statements that we're worried our clients might need to address. But for the most part, if you focus in on incident response and change management, you're going to be covering a lot of those very common issues and quite a few of the common issues that I just showed you in that in the CAT mate. And so the incident response testing, which by the way is going to be the subject of our next webinar, is one of the more difficult controls to get off the ground, even if you have been doing tabletop tests of your disaster recovery plan. And the main reason why is because it's a lot different than disaster recovery. And that's one of the great things that comes out of an incident response test, is that your incident response team ends up reflecting on the notion that, you know what, this was a lot different than our disaster recovery test. And the reason why is because in a disaster, you get to blame the disaster. You know what I'm saying? And so the whole notion of do we need to inform our clients is not there. Whereas in an incident, unfortunately, the incidents that we're most concerned about are those where we're to blame. And so incident response testing needs to put your management team in a position where when that career-threatening event does occur, they recognize the process as you unfold it. And that's not going to happen by reading your plan. That's not going to happen by reading your policy. That can only happen by putting your incident response team through a tabletop test, or you could have a breach. I mean, quite frankly, one of the things that we noticed over the years is that the banks that had the early breaches are the banks that are in very good shape from the cybersecurity assessment tool perspective. And so obviously we don't want to have a breach, but if you do have a breach, do a post-mortem review so you can get Maalox test credit, is what Dwayne Berg of the OCC called it. And speaking of post-mortem reviews, it's the #1 thing I'm really looking for as an auditor when it comes to your whole incident response process, because that's where we document what you've learned. You know, I love what the guy from FIS said at cybersecurity conference last year. If you came to that conference, you got to see FIS's new president come in and talk about what he went through, because the FIS had, you know, a very terrible breach, and then they end up in big trouble with the, you know, TSP examination program, etc. But what the gentleman from FIS said was that going through a breach is like going through boot camp. You never want to do it again. It's certainly, you know, something that you hated as you were going through it, but you learned so much from it, and you kind of are prepared forever now. And so that post-mortem review is where we capture what we've learned from either the test or the real breach. And so, you know, when you look at everything that needs to happen from an incident response management perspective, that post-mortem review is something that's very important that I'll be looking for. The other thing to know is that if it's a tabletop test, what that means is you have 3 documents. You have the test plan that you've presented to your incident response team in this case, and they've approved that in advance of your test. And then there's the minutes of the actual test, which, you know, could be cryptic. They're usually very hard to, you know, take notes while you're in a test, but, you know, they don't have to be very well formatted or whatever. And then there's a summary of those minutes, and really and we've pulled the action items, we pulled the lessons out of that, those minutes, and that's the post-mortem review. The other thing to know is that, you know, if you can measure broadcast awareness, if your auditor can work with you to measure how quickly does our team recognize, you know, we're under a pretext calling attack or a phishing attack or whatever, and spread the word, that's a very good thing to do that can turn that social engineering test into a functional test of your incident response process. And so when I originally talked about simplifying incident response, this is the slide that was going to be the agenda for our webinar here today. And if you look at that CAT-MATE, you'll see that each of these items here, you know, this is in the governance section, this is in the governance, or, you know, I call it the governance, but the risk management, you know, domain 1. This is in domain 5, you know, this is in domain 3, you know, etc. It spans all 5 domains. There's really only one statement in the 4th domain, but it's about knowing where your data goes so that we can respond to, you know, the fact that our data might be going places that, you know, we didn't realize when we're in an incident. And so I do have on the portal the Simplified Incident Response Program. What I want you to know is that this is circa, I mean, this was updated, I believe, last year. Yeah, in August of 2015. And it's going to be updated again. We have a workshop coming up in July. But what we did with this is we went with the one-page policy approach, where there's a high-level policy that, you know, requires management, you know, to create an incident response team, who will then create this incident response plan. The plan is very notification-centric. I feel small banks should simplify their classification process to be centered around when do we need to notify the customer, and of course you're welcome to customize that to your bank and use that as the basis of a more simple, more effective approach to responding to incidents. The second biggest thing I think that's going to come out of, you know, incident response in the cybersecurity assessment tool is what the tool calls anomalous activity detection. You know, running a baseline on your network, watching your network traffic, responding to event logs that, you know, are anomalous, the whole 9 yards. And, you know, really that's going to, you know, is something that you need to, you know, outsource to your managed security service provider. One of the things that I kind of glossed over, but column N here is if your MSSP can completely cover the statement, we've put a 1 in column N. All right, and so I don't know how I have this filter, but as you can see, there's quite a bit. I think there's 85 different statements that your MSSP you can completely outsource the work to your MSSP. We also have identified where your MSSP can help, and this is really kind of the area at least Infotex can. I'm fairly confident that, actually I should say I'm 100% confident that SecureWorks, Trustway, Perimeter, Datacom, all the MSSPs out there that are working with banks now can help you fully cover the items we've marked as a 1 in column N there. If you've been coming to my webinars about incident response, you know that I'm a purveyor of the fact that you should diagram your security monitoring architecture. And this is kind of a generic diagram of what your security monitoring architecture would look like. And so over here we have what you're doing on your own. You maybe have some DLP and some endpoint security. Obviously you've got antivirus systems in place, content filtering, spyware filtering, that sort of thing. And we can get the logs from that and bring that into the event log management system and use that to kind of give us better, visibility into what's going on with the network traffic. Change detection, the tool, by the way, calls it port monitoring. We should have called it port monitoring, but basically monitoring firewall ports, reviewing your firewall rules on a regular basis, on a quarterly basis, that sort of thing. The only thing that your managed security service provider really isn't connected in, unless you have them, sit in on your incident response team meetings, is, the non-technical threat intelligence that most of us are now getting from FS-ISAC because of the second domain of the cybersecurity assessment tool. But, you can bring in threat intelligence from other areas as well. And so what I wanted to do is I just kind of wanted to overlay on this diagram the numbers on the cybersecurity assessment tool that if you're engaged with a managed security service provider, you'll be able to check off. It just really helps you address incident response, at least, or security monitoring, because your MSSP is in the business of 85 of those 494 statements. 29 of them, by the way, are baseline statements. And so, get with your MSSP after going through that cat mate, and it's just a matter of filtering. Once you've gone through this, once you've converted yours into this, if and you might have a bunch of 1s, right? And so then you're just filtering to where you're not compliant and where your MSSP can help you cover it. And now you have an agenda to talk to your MSSP about, and make sure you lay a paper trail of that so that you're showing your auditors and examiners what you're doing during the analysis and interpretation process. And so, and by the way, that workshop I alluded to earlier, it's on Bastille Day, July 14th. It's at the Indiana Bankers Association. It is not a free workshop. They charge a pretty decent chunk of change to get into it, but it's about a 6-7 hour workshop. We are going to actually walk through a couple incident response tests. It's going to be very focused in on incident response planning and training your incident response teams. And by the way, I'm kind of leading towards your incident response team should have a subcommittee, so to speak, called your change management team. And we already kind of went through and looked at all the statements that can be covered in your incident response team meetings, as well as your change management team meetings is what we're suggesting. And so we're kind of going towards maybe your change management team, which is 3 or 4 people on your incident response team, meets weekly or bi-weekly, and then the incident response team meets monthly. And so from a change management perspective, we have kind of queued up what we would suggest along those lines. And so imagine once a week, 3 members of your team sit down to a change management spreadsheet. We've been doing this, by the way, at Infotex since about 2005. We actually use our change management spreadsheet to govern 3 different meetings: the tech team meeting, the management team meeting, and the extra management team meeting is what we call it, where we actually have owners sit in on that particular management team meeting. And so we have some suggested language that you could use here. This was, by the way, for a bank where their IT security steering committee was what I call congruent with their IRT, with their incident response team. A lot of smaller banks are doing that. They're just saying, hey, we already have a multidisciplinary information technology steering committee, so let's let our incident response team be equal to that committee. Now, where you get into trouble with that is when you have outside board members on your IT steering committee, which is a great thing, but usually they don't want to attend all the incident response team meetings as well. So now you're adding one more meeting or an extra hour to your existing, committee meeting or whatever. Then meanwhile, all the issues related to change management are going to really be boring and eye glazing over type issues for the incident response team at large. And that's why we've identified, maybe you have these kind of issues be handled by the change management team rather than the incident response team. And I'm not sure, I guess they got this filtered down to what the MSSP can completely cover for you. And so, the bottom line is we also have on the portal available to you, and we also put in there, by the way, a sample. We just went through our own change management spreadsheet and sanitized, a few entries just so you can get an example of the type of things that we do. We actually have archived descriptions over because we've been doing this for so long, and a lot of this is cyclical. And so, by the way, what we do if it's cyclical is when it's done, we mark the due date, but instead of over here marking as Z done so it gets it out of the way, we just basically, if it's done and it's cyclical, we'll just basically say, okay, well, we'll pick that up again in 2017, in April of 2017. And so then, at the end of every year, you've got to go through and update, and assign those to the actual dates that you want to review it. And so this just kind of drives when you're reviewing the issue. This is who the issue is assigned to. We categorize by client, or infrastructure if it's us, or if it's compliance, we call it the information security program calendar, etc. And so hopefully this will be helpful if you're looking for a place to get started when it comes to change management. In summary, and I'm really sorry that I'm already 10 minutes over schedule here. The good news is I'm supposed to be somewhere 11:30. I'll have to call them and let them know I'm late. But the incident response really does affect a lot of different components, a lot of different factors of the cybersecurity assessment tool. And so we feel if you focus in on incident response, you're going to be killing a lot of birds with one stone, so to speak. And so I'm assuming Michael's probably chatting you this link so you don't have to write it down, but suffice it to say it's, our domain name, CAD 04/12/16, which is today's date. Mike?
But thank you so much for joining us today. We appreciate your time, and we hope you guys have an excellent week. Thanks, Dan.
Thank you, everybody. Thanks, Mike.
When you view an InfoTex webinar or movie, you do so with 4 caveats. First, you're agreeing to the terms posted at the web page listed on this slide. Second, our lawyers want you to know that what InfoTex presents is often time-dated or about new trends, regulations, or guidance, and therefore we cannot provide this material with any warranty whatsoever. Thirdly, material provided with InfoTex webinars and movies is copyrighted. You keep the copyright to material customized to your organization, but InfoTex reserves the right to use the material in other engagements and boilerplates. See our transfer of copyright agreement at the web page listed in this slide. Finally, those who view our webinars or movies may be added to an email mailing list. If you do not wish to receive notice of additional educational opportunities, please accept our apologies and please opt out at the web page shown on this slide.